Well, good evening. Thank you all for joining us this evening for what I'm sure will be an informative, lively discussion between Dr. Mahmoud Ayoub, author of A Muslim View of Christianity, and Dr. Michel, author of A Christian View of Islam. Mahmoud Ayoub is faculty associate in Islam and Christian-Muslim relations at Hartford Seminary and has been with us since 2008. Previously, he was professor and director of Islamic studies at the Department of Religion at Temple University in Philadelphia. Throughout his academic career, Dr. Ayoub has received distinguished awards and scholarships, both for his achievements and researches. He is the author of a number of books, including Redemptive Suffering in Islam and the Qur'an and Its Interpreters. Fr.Thomas Michel, a Jesuit, which is relative for today, is the senior fellow at the Prince Alawi bin Talal Center for Muslim Christian Understanding at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. In 1981, Father Michel began work in the Vatican's Pontifical Council for Interreligious Dialogue, where he became the head of office for relations with Muslims. He remained in the Vatican office for 13 years until 1994, during which time he spent 4 years teaching an introduction to Christian theology in universities in Turkey. Between 1994 and 2008, Father Michel served as Executive Secretary for the Office of Interreligious and Ecumenical Affairs, based in Bangkok, Thailand, and as Secretary for Interreligious Dialogue for the Jesuits, based in Rome. Tonight, the two longtime colleagues will share a dialogue about their respective books and the subject matter of how Christians view Islam and how Muslims view Christianity. The topics they will talk about will range from the need for dialogue, approaches to interreligious dialogue, Muslim and Christians in history, and Muslim-Christian dialogue in the modern period. I am sure they will touch upon more topics as time permits, and after their talk, there will be a book signing. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Ayoub and Father Michel. Just as a brief word of the service of order, I believe the first topic they wanted to discuss is the need for dialogue between the two faiths. And then from there, I believe they were going to discuss how Christians view Muhammad in the Quran and how Muslims view Christ.
Well, why dialogue? I think in one sense it's no mystery. It's through dialogue that we grow. It's through dialogue that we learn things. My own, what would you say, path as an adult has been pretty much living as a Christian with Muslims. And I think there were two influences that led me this way. One were I was teaching English in Indonesia back in 1969. And I joined the Jesuits there, so that's my home province. And my provincial said, well, talk to people and see what you're going to be doing here for the future. And so I talked to a lot of people. And I also mentioned to my students that I was hoping to go on for studies. And some of my Muslim students said, well, why don't you study Islam? That way you can help Christians and others come to a better understanding of Islam, and you can help Muslims come to a better understanding of Christianity. And that really got me thinking. Is something I thought I would like to do. And I can remember in the weeks following that, I got out my copy of the documents of the Second Vatican Council, which was quite a new book in those days. This was 1969, and the council was only over a couple of years. And it was really there that I saw this as something good. I remember the first phrase in Nostra Aetate about Muslims is, the church regards Muslims with esteem. And I thought, we do? I hadn't really thought much about that. I didn't know any Muslims before I went to Indonesia. But I thought, now here, this is going to give me a direction for my studies. Find out what are the reasons for this esteem that we should have for Muslims. Find out how I can communicate this esteem. So I'm talking about something now that happened 44 years ago or whatever. But I'm really convinced that in the passage of 44 years of dialogue, constantly in dialogue, that it's been such a wonderful blessing for me. And this gives me the hope that it's as much of a blessing for my Muslim brothers and sisters that it is for me. I'm just convinced this is the way God works in our lives. In the encounter, the most powerful one is always God, God's own self. What about you, Mahmoud?
Yes, I grew up in two traditions. I went to a Christian Protestant school in Beirut, a school for the blind, when I was 7 years old. I did not convert to Christianity. I grew up a Christian in this school and a Muslim of sorts at home. I say of sorts because as I grew older, I did practice Christianity and tried very hard to save my parents' soul. My father didn't know how to deal with it. My mother always said, don't leave him alone. God will guide him to what is right. And God guided me to what, not so much what is right, but to what is right for me. I eventually returned to Islam fully, not because I have renounced Christianity, but I had acquired a deeper, I believe, and perhaps more meaningful for me anyhow, understanding and relationship to Christianity. I am very convinced that for our two communities, which together make almost half the world's population, dialogue is not something good, but it is imperative. And it is one of the imperatives of the Qur'an. The Qur'an begins with dialogue. The Qur'an says, call to the way of your Lord with wisdom and good exhortation, and debate with them, dialogue with them, that is the people of the book, in the fairest manner. And there are many other verses in the Qur'an that call on Muslims to dialogue. It's very important that the Qur'an considers Christians to be the nearest in amity to Muslims. Why? Because the Qur'an says, among them, that is the Christians, there are monks and learned men, and they are not proud. And when they hear the truth, you see their eyes well up with tears as they recognize it. And they pray God to include them among the witnesses, among the people who will enter paradise. Now, what did the Quran, in my view, want from Jews, Christians, and the people of other faiths, but particularly Jews and Christians who were around the time of the Prophet Muhammad in Arabia? I am convinced that what the Quran and the Prophet wanted is dialogue between the two communities, through which the two communities recognizes each other as a community of faith in the one God, and as a community that is only called on to recognize the other as being a revelation from God. As things worked out and dialogue became important, and in fact we are not dialoguing for the first time in the 20th century and now the 21st century. Dialogue, even on an official level, began already in the 3rd century of the Hijrah, that is in the 9th century or even earlier. And people did dialogue, and they tried to achieve a measure of recognition and tolerance towards the other community. But I think the goals for dialogue must go far beyond simple recognition and tolerance. It has in recent years come to realize the importance of our common spiritual and physical, at least for Arabs and Jews, ancestry to Abraham, peace be upon him. And we must go beyond that to recognize the validity of the truth of religions as God revealed them, because God did not speak only in Hebrew or Arabic, and to accept God's gift for all of us, to learn from God's revelations and to try to hear God's voice through both our own religious tradition and the tradition of the other. And it is meetings like these that I feel will bring us closer together, in spite of, and let me mention only one still major obstacle, and in spite of this obstacle, and that is Father Thomas Michel speaks in his book of proclamation versus dialogue. This is the problem, it remains with us. Are we really ready to engage in honest dialogue among equals, to recognize the truth of the Qur'an for Muslims and also the truth of Christ for Christians, and to dialogue as sisters and brothers in faith, by which dialogue my faith as a Muslim would be deepened by your faith as a Christian or a Jew or whatever. And if we do succeed in going beyond this great obstacle and not use dialogue for da'wah or mission, then we will have achieved what I believe the final purpose of dialogue ought to be, which is a fellowship of faith. And I have always seen in Father Thomas Michel as a fellow dialogue traveler with me on the journey of life from the world of creation eventually to the Creator. Thank you.
Yeah, I think Mahmoud was really wise in starting off with what does the Quran teach about dialogue? And he said it very well. And well, it raises the question for us Christians, what does the Bible say about dialogue? And explicitly, it doesn't say very much. The Greek word for dialogue, I think it's dialogue, appears 4 times in the New Testament only. And curiously enough, 3 of those times are in chapter 19 of the Acts of the Apostles, when Paul is in Ephesus. And that's really one of the most curious chapters in the Acts of the Apostles. Most of the time, Paul is running from one place to another and preaching and forming communities and then taking off, going somewhere else. He gets to Ephesus and he stays for 2 years. And the text teaches us, what was he doing during those 2 years? Well, he's doing many different things, but it says he went every day to the Schola of Tyrannus. The Schola was a Stoic philosophical school, and there he engaged in dialogue, deliberation. The word means discussion, deliberation, thinking together, communicating. All of these ideas go into it. And he did this for about 2 years. And what were the results? Well, when the silversmiths got angry with him, it says it was the Asiarchs who were the officials of the pagan games. And it says these Asiarchs who had become friends of Paul, they warned him not to go down to the square because there was going to be trouble there. So he had made friends with these pagan officials. And then when the town clerk goes down to the square to resolve the thing, he says, these two men, Paul and the other one, they have not spoken badly of our goddess, who was Artemis, of course. And I've always been impressed by that Paul, in his own preaching, in his own conviction of God's action for humans in Christ, didn't put down the other beliefs to do so. And I think there's some really good lessons there for us. Shall we go on?
Yeah, I wanted to say something about the Prophet Muhammad and Christ, at least for Muslims. We are told in the Sirah literature that the Prophet Muhammad actually came in contact with Christians. Of course, there was the Christian Waraq bin Nawfal, the relative of his wife Khadija, but then there must have been other Christians who formed important communities in South Arabia. And this is probably behind the Prophet's beautiful observation that he made. He said, I sense the breath of the merciful Nafas al-Rahman from the Yemen. The Yemen that was at that time a country of largely people of the book, Jews and Christians. And among these Christians were the Christians of Najran. Today in Saudi Arabia, at the time was part of the Yemen of South Arabia, who came to Medina and concluded a treaty with the Prophet and the new Muslim community. So there is the Prophet Muhammad in the Qur'an does not assign to himself any miracles. He is just a servant of God and his messenger. And it is in this way that the Prophet Muhammad and the Qur'an see Jesus Christ, peace be upon him, as God's servant and messenger. Now, I believe as a Muslim, and maybe we should begin dialoguing exactly. As a Muslim, I believe that I can live with the theology of the Gospels. That Christ is divine, I find acceptable, and it's more than acceptable. It gives me greater faith in my own humanity and humanity in general, that the human could become divine as Christ did, both through his virgin birth and his miracles, his life, and everything around him. For me as a Muslim, and what I find really problematic is to say Jesus is God. When I met for the first time the Anglican bishop, may God have mercy on him, Kenneth Cragg, who died not so long ago, and Cragg always argued that Islam is a good religion, but it's a halfway house because Muslims do not have Christ. And my argument was, we do actually love Christ and we venerate Christ. And Nostra Aetate, Father Michel, recognizes that for the Muslims. But I said to Kenneth Craig, and I say it now, can I say Jesus is God and remain a Muslim? And you know what Bishop Craig said to me? He said, I can't say that either. So I said, probably you are closer to Islam than you realize. As a Muslim and following the Qur'an, I regard every believer in God, men, women, as Muslims in the broad and deep sense of the term Islam, of submission of my own will to the will of God. And Jesus is my teacher, as he was the teacher of those who were his contemporaries, as we read in both the Synoptic Gospels and the Gospel of John. Even John, with its high Christology and the incarnation at the beginning of the Gospel, at some point says, the Father is greater than the Son. And he said to the woman after the resurrection, go tell my brethren, I am going to your Father and to my Father, to your God and to my God. So, I wonder now, can I be also a Muslim and a Christian in this sense? Thank you.
Mahmoud mentioned just now the Nostra Aetate document, which is, in a lot of ways is a starting point for many of us in dialogue. But you'll notice a couple of things that are not in that document. There's no mention of Muhammad, and there's no mention of Islam as a religion, and there's no mention of the Quran. Now, Muslims have said to me various times over the course of the years, how can you say anything meaningful about our religion if you don't address the whole question of Islam as a religion, Muhammad as a prophet, or the Quran as sacred scripture? Well, they have a point, of course. But I'm kind of happy that they don't have anything in there, that they don't try to say something. I think if the church had made some sort of definitive statement back in the 1960s, I think it would have been, by necessity, immature. It would have had much more of an effect of putting an end to the discussion, putting an end to our own theological investigation of these questions. Of what does it mean for a Christian to be seeing the action of prophecy going on after Christ? What does that mean? Well, since they didn't say anything explicit, since they did not pronounce on these issues, our theologians, all of our people are able to keep on our own reflections and to grow more deeply in what is involved in these issues. And I think that's a good thing. I was just telling my friend Michel that I came back only Sunday from Oxford, where a small group of us, Christian theologians, all Christians, but who've all had background of doing Islamic studies, where we tried to look at these issues of these issues that we're all debating in the light of the objections, of the questions raised to us by Muslims. See, I think that if you look up until, say, the 12th century, the most serious Christian theology was being done in Arab countries, in Baghdad and Cairo and Damascus. And it was being done with the omnipresent Muslim who was hearing everything that was said and reading everything that was written as soon as it came out. But then when our theological centers moved into Western Europe, then our theology could continue, but really didn't have to pay much attention to things that seemed either nonsense or sometimes blasphemous to the Muslim ear. And I think that we lost something in our theological development. So this is what we've been trying to, 3 years ago, I should say 2 years ago, we talked about the triune God. And what do we understand and mean by that? Then last year we talked about the whole question of redemption and salvation. I think I used to find Mahmoud that when I was teaching Christianity in Turkey or in Iran, that people could understand how Christians believe in one God, when it's explained, I think, in a good way. But what they really found hard to understand was our concept of redemption. Because for Muslims, it tends to make God into a monster. They say, well, what kind of a father would do this, would permit this, would not do everything possible to avoid his son being killed in such a horrible way. So I think that's the most difficult thing for us Christian theologians to face. This year, we were talking about the whole question of prophecy and revelation and that.
I'm willing to go again as far as the Quran goes. The Quran in some verses does criticize the Trinity, but in Surah 4, the Quran clearly says, "Say, O people of the book, do not go into extreme limits in your religion. لا تغلوا في دينكم." And I find it important that the Quran calls Christian belief somehow exaggerated rather than blasphemous. And the problem, I really think, is historical. Every religion can deal far more easily with what came before it than what comes after it. And the Muslims somehow accepted, or Islam generally, accepted Christianity as a revealed religion, but found the Christians at fault because of their faith in the triune God. The Muslims did more or less the opposite. Rather, the Christians did the opposite. The Muslims accept Christianity, but not Christians. The Christians accepted Muslims, but not Islam. And the last conference we had at Georgetown, actually, the bridges, building bridges for the Archbishop of Canterbury. The problem, Muhammad remains a problem for Christians to accept as a prophet from God who brought a religion by which many live in this life and hope for the life to come. And perhaps the next major step in dialogue, for me at any rate, is when we are able and willing to accept each other as religions willed and revealed by God. Satan would not do such a good thing as Islam and Christianity. It must be the work of God in our life and history. And I think both religions can speak to us all in a very concrete way. Islam can serve as a good reminder to Christians to be not always Christocentric, but theocentric sometimes. And the same thing with Christianity for Muslims. Christianity begins with the idea of a fallen humanity. And God, in a way, comes down to save this fallen humanity. And Islam looks at humanity the exact opposite. Whatever Adam did, he asked for God's forgiveness, and Adam becomes not only the first sinner, but the first prophet in Islam. And human perfection, which is expressed or embodied in prophetic existence, as I call it, is possible. And so God shows the Muslims more the stick, than the carrot, because they have an elevated view of human beings. Because Islam itself was a success story in its early centuries. And in the final analysis, I believe that the step that we should take is to, as I said before, try to hear the voice of God through our religions. For me, one of the interesting and meaningful ideas, Father, is an Eastern Orthodox idea. The idea of theosis, or deification, divinization. That Jesus Christ, who is the greatest philanthropos, lover of human being, became human in order that we may become divine. I do not need to accept this theologically, but I can humanistically learn from this the value of humanity for God. God, when He intended to create the human race, He announced to the angels, I am about to place in the earth a vicegerent, a steward, a representative, Khalifa, and it is us, sinful human beings, who are that steward. Maybe we should...
Let me just say one more thing before we open up for questions and discussion. I think that the whole question of who is a prophet and can you have prophets before or after, I think there's a deeper question on which Muslims and Christians agree. And I think that is, what is our criterion of truth? And I think every religious community must have a criterion. How do you judge between what is true and what is false, what is correct, what's incorrect, what's good, what's bad? And we have a criterion. And for Muslims, that criterion is the divine word that they find in the Qur'an.
It's divine oneness, Father.
Yeah.
The criterion is Tawheed.
But where do you find it? You would
In the
find it in
Qur'an.
the Qur'an.
Yes.
Right. So then when you see something in the Bible, Jesus born of a virgin, Jesus performed miracles, well, you accept that very easily because it's in agreement with your criterion of truth, what you find in the Quran.
Mm-hmm.
If we believe something